You know this one. And you know this one. Those ideas are connected to two different flavors of altered dominant chords. Today, we're going to break those down, look at some ideas that each one creates, and see if it is really necessary to invest the time to practice both of them. All right, let's just dig right into things. We're looking at these two different types of altered dominant chords, the so-called altered chord and then the just dominant 7 flat 9, kind of the differences between these two, how we build them, what we do with them. So let's start with the so-called altered chord or alt chord. You can see this sort of referred to as a couple different ways. You might refer to it as just altered, you might refer to it as superlocrian, maybe the diminished whole tone scale, maybe the 7th mode of melodic minor. All of these mean the same thing. These different terminologies are all connecting to a scale that has a root, a flat 9, a sharp 9, a major third, a sharp 11, a flat 13, and a flat 7. Now, this way of thinking where we think about sort of a baseline scale, in this case I'd be starting from G major and making the necessary alterations to make this G-alt scale, is my preferred approach. Another approach that you might commonly encounter that I do think is important to understand, even though I might not really be thinking about it so much when I'm improvising, is using what's called a parent scale. So I mentioned the superlocrian mode. This is really maybe like the hard and fast way to understand where these come from a theoretical standpoint. So what that is the 7th mode of melodic minor. You might be familiar with the modes of your major scale, Dorian, Mixolydian, all that kind of stuff. Melodic minor creates modes as well that are very useful to us as improvisers. So if we go to the 7th step of a melodic minor scale, and we play melodic minor starting on that note, that's going to give us this set of alteration. So here we're working on G, so we got to think G is the 7th note of what melodic minor scale? So it would be A flat. So if we think about our A flat melodic minor, we've got, basically an A flat major scale with an addition of a flat third in it, but we start on the G. That is going to give us this scale and going to give us this set of alterations. Again, not necessarily my preferred approach on this, but one that you absolutely want to understand the sort of theoretical underpinnings of this sound. So where do you see this in your music? It could happen anywhere where there is a dominant chord. Essentially, it's going to be indicated by a chord nomenclature that has a altered 9, a flat 9, a sharp 9, and a flat 13. That flat 13 is the important part to watch out for. You might also just see alt, G7alt, that implies the same thing, or you might occasionally see, rather than a flat 13, a sharp 5 indicated. They are the same pitch, and they really indicate the same type of chord, this altered sound that has all of these alterations. All right, that is our first flavor of altered dominant. Our second one we're going to get into is the so-called diminished dominant scale. So this is sometimes called an octatonic scale because that actually has 8 different pitches in it. You could also call it the half-whole diminished. Again, all these things mean the basic same scale. This is incredibly similar to the first scale that we talked about, and that's why we really want to think about if we need to learn both of these. We will get to that in a second. This has a root, a flat 9, sharp 9, major third, sharp 11, 5th, 6th, both from the major scale, so like the major 5th and the major 6th, flat 7, and then the root again. The way we create this scale is a little bit different than most of the other ones we use as improvisers. This is created by a symmetrical pattern of half steps and whole steps. This one might be referred to as the half-whole diminished scale because the half step is first. So if we look at our scale, we've got G, then we go up a half step to A flat. Then we go up a whole step to B flat, then a half step to B natural, and so on and so forth up the scale. That's how we get this set of alterations on a G dominant 7th chord. The symmetrical nature of this is very important as we figure out what we're going to apply this scale with. Just like our first chord, you can see this with a number of different chord nomenclatures. I would say most commonly you're just going to see G7 flat 9 or G7 sharp 9. You might also see it in combination with like G7 flat 9 sharp 9 or whatever with a sharp 11, or probably the most accurate way to depict this sound if you're very wanting something specific is to say G13 flat 9 sharp 11. That leaves no doubt in sort of the piano player's mind or the improviser's mind that we want a natural 13 or the major 13, because that's really the biggest thing that differentiates this from our altered scale. And if we look at these two scales just right next to each other, we can see that they're almost identical. Flat 9 in both, sharp 9 in both, major third in both, sharp 11 in both, flat 7 in both. It's really just a matter of whether we have an E flat in one, a D, and an E natural in the other. So that begs the question, why do we actually care about learning these two scales if they are so similar to each other? For me, the importance comes when we think about the type of ideas that these scales can help inform. Now, any music theory concept is only as useful as it helps us to understand the music we're listening to and maybe transcribing, or as it helps us to understand maybe the music we're hearing in our head and want to create. And so these two scales can lead us to two distinct sets of ideas. There's going to be some overlap for sure because some of the notes are the same. But the construction of them, especially the symmetrical nature of the second one, can lead us to very different type of ideas than the altered scale does. So let's look at just a handful of these and see how they can really lead us in very different directions with the type of ideas that we create with them. So let's start with our altered scale. So right at the top, you heard me play an absolute classic sort of little nugget of improvisational vocabulary. I would maybe call this like the Night Tunisia lick or the Dizzy lick or something like that. This is kind of something that probably many people were playing, but I think it really is sort of etched in our mind as like the end of Dizzy Gillespie's cadenza on Night Tunisia. He oftentimes would go to this on many different recordings. I played it this way. So that's, one interpretation of it. But the real key part of this lick, this almost always occurs when we're going 5-1, or we could maybe think 2-5-1, oftentimes in a minor key. And so the real key to this lick is actually not the beginning part that I played, it's just the very little end tag, the root up to the flat 13, down to the third, that's all of the G chord of G7, and then we resolve to the 9 of our eventual resolution chord. So this little chunk. That's the part that you'll hear all over the place in a million variations, all across, different tunes, different people's solo. That little nugget, that comes from the altered scale. Hitting that flat 13 to major third to resolving to the 9 is like the sound of altered in many, many ways. So that's sort of like a quote unquote cliche kind of little idea that we could use with this. What if we just applied the scale a little bit more as a scale? That is a 2-5-1 idea that I'm pretty sure I stole from Kenny Dorham. This is, in all honesty, one of the first things I remember learning that started to get into some of these altered dominant chords. So what we've got here, we've got a pretty typical thing on the 2 chord, just arpeggiating down, back up, resolving from the 7th of the 2 chord to the 3rd of the 5 chord. And then that 5 chord, because I want to maybe access some of this altered sound, some of these more crunchy notes, notes that have a little tension in them, I just jump up to that flat 13 and then just straight down the scale. Very, very clear usage of this sound. Now, what if we want to take this and maybe not just play the scale or just play some sort of predetermined lick or like a piece of just the jazz language on it, but we want to look at it more in a music theory sense. So there are lots of little other chords that are embedded inside of this particular scale that you can use to create some interesting shapes in your improvisation. So check out this little short 2-5-1. Again, we've got something pretty typical going on in the 2 chord, sort of just almost an arpeggio shape, just like a triad shape with one extra note. It's when we get to the 5 chord again, where we're interested because we're talking about dominant chords. So if we look at these notes, you can see I hit some alterations. I hit the sharp 9, the flat 9, down to the flat 13, flat 7, and then eventually resolve to the 5th of the next chord. But if we actually take this apart and look at those notes, how they're grouped together, we can see actually all those notes are from the key of E flat. It's actually kind of like a little 5-note scale or almost like a triadic shape in E flat that we've added some passing notes to. So that's actually a triad shape based off of the flat 13 of the dominant chord. Looking for these little embedded chord shapes inside of any scale, let alone an altered scale or whatever, can be really, really useful to finding different ideas and different ways of looking at the changes. This one just happens to access most of the interesting notes that are in a G7 altered chord. All right, that's the altered side of the equation. To me, those ideas tend to lend to more bebop-ish sounding ideas, especially on 2-5-1s that resolve to minor chords. That altered 5 chord where we have flat 9, flat 9, sharp 9, flat 13, that really likes to resolve to minor because in our case, say we're going from G to C minor, we now have an E flat in that G7 chord. So that's going to push us to minor more. Now it can also be cool if it goes to major. It's maybe a somewhat of a surprise resolution, not that much of a surprise, but just a little more interesting resolution. But they really lend to more diatonic sounding ideas. They fit into C minor, the kind of key center of C minor. When we go to this diminished dominant one, this symmetrical half whole, this can work in a similar way, but I think is really great for building more like patternistic type of ideas because of the symmetrical nature of the scale. Now, a couple months ago, from at least when I'm first releasing this, I did do a video about like a couple of different ways to practice this and a couple of different like items of vocabulary, licks, lines that you might want to work on, especially things that are very playable on trombone. Some of these symmetrical things can be a little tricky to play. So I'll throw up a card and you can check out that video. I think it's a really useful starter for these ideas. This is a really deep area of music theory. There's lots of little nooks and crannies to getting this stuff together. We're going to talk about a few simple things today, and that video has a few other simple things that can get you started. All right, now the diminished dominant idea that I started the video with, that is an absolute classic. This entire idea would work great on a 2-5-1, in our case the C major, because the 5 chord is G, but you could also push it anywhere where you have a long chunk of dominant chords. So let's break down a little bit what's going on here. So this idea is based off of all the parts of this scale that have the whole step going down. So as we know, it's half whole, and so on and so forth up the scale. If we're descending, we're going to have a half step, or excuse me, a whole step going down first. So for example, we'd have G to F. If we go to our next place, we have a whole step, it's going to be B flat to A flat, and then C sharp to B, then E to D, and then we'll be right back to G to F. So we get these little 4 groupings of whole steps going down. So we can manipulate these in a number of different ways to create ideas. This is referred to as the so-called David Baker diminished lick. David Baker was a well-known jazz educator, trombone and cello player. He wrote a number of books that are very useful. Some of them are just like a compendium of licks, really great if you're trying to get that aspect of your playing together. But this lick is one of the ones that he sort of puts forward as the sound of this scale. So if we play these 2-note groupings going up, we get this idea. Useful, pretty basic, but very useful. Now, if we were to play these going down, we would actually just get the scale, just by the way they sort of work out. So if we want to maybe play a descending idea here, and that's the idea that I started with, we've got to create a little pattern for it. So instead of just playing them descending, I'm going to skip around a little bit. So my idea starts on the one that starts on an E. So I do an E to a D, that's my whole step down. Rather than just going down, I'm going to jump up to the next one, the G to the F. Then, because again, I can't just go right down because it's just going to create a scale, I will jump down to the C sharp, so I'll skip over the E natural sort of like note grouping, and then jump back up to it. So altogether, I might get this. And then you continue that pattern down through the scale of alternating, skipping notes, all that sort of stuff. And you can go as far as you want to. That's one of the things that's really great about these sort of patterns. There's a whole bunch of ways that you can vary this base pattern. So that time I started on a 2-note grouping. I went up and then I skipped down. What if I started in a 2-note grouping, skip down, and then go back up? Basically the same lick, just gives it sort of a little different vibe, sort of where the resolution points happen. As I mentioned, this scale has some really deep, involved music theory if you want to get into every little area of how to use it. Start with this lick. It is relatively friendly to trombone playing. It doesn't have a lot of huge intervals in it. It's relatively scalar. It, to me, is an absolutely must-know part of the improvisational vocabulary because it's all over the place in jazz. You'll hear lots of different people playing it in long stretches, in small chunks. And so you want to have some good command over this very foundational one before you move on, because that little 2-note grouping aspect of this sort of informs many other ideas that you could use with this particular sound. Cool. Hopefully you can hear how these 2 different scales and 2 sort of flavors of dominant chords with alterations can send you in kind of 2 different directions. Obviously they're not completely different. They're all sort of going to be this like medium crunchy dominant chord. But to me, that altered scale is a little more diatonic, maybe a little more inside sounding, a little more bebop sounding. These diminished dominant ideas sound a little more outside, a little bit more, again, patternistic, so you can kind of like cram them in there in a way that might not work in every case because the pattern itself is very strong and very melodic. So see what we can do with both of these different flavors. I would practice both scales. I would try to get some vocabulary together on both of these, and that way you'll have them at your disposal. Now, when you're actually playing with other people, sometimes a piano player might be playing altered, might be playing diminished dominant. You might be playing the other version of it. it's all going to work out fine. There might be a momentary little clash, but the better musicians you're playing with and the more that you are listening intently, the more you can sort of like catch what people are doing on the fly, and then maybe you adjust your line or maybe try to realize that, oh, the piano player is playing mostly altered chords in this section of the tune. Next chorus, I'm going to try to follow them. I'm not going to try to hit so much of this diminished dominant stuff. I'm going to try to get to more altered stuff. That's kind of where the fun starts to come in improvising, where you can kind of feel each other out. You're starting to have a little bit of a musical conversation, even about these very fine details. Cool. See you in the woodshed.